But when technology shifts, if you're still stuck playing the old game, you might get very good at playing a game which does not make sense anymore.
Welcome to the Meaningful Work, Meaningful Life podcast, the show that empowers you to redefine the life you want and live your best life now. I'm your host, Francine Belly, and in season 11, On Purpose, How to Live, Lead, and Thrive in the AI Age, we are exploring how to align personal purpose, leadership, and innovation without losing your human heartbeat. Today's guests argue that AI won't reshape our world because it is smart, but restructure everything around it, whether it is industries, jobs, value chains, and even how we coordinate as humans. So if you've ever worried about where you fit in this new world, this conversation will give you clarity and a way forward. So my guest is Sangeet Paul Choudary. He's one of the world's leading thinkers on platform, ecosystem, and the future of value creation. And he's also the author of Platform Revolution and most recently Reshuffle, Who Wins When AI Restacks the Knowledge Economy. He advised governments, tech giants, and global organizations on how AI will reorganize industry. So, Sanjeet, welcome to the Meaningful Work, Meaningful Life podcast.
Thank you, Francine. Such a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sanjeet, for really being in this podcast. But before we start, I'd like you to take me back to where it all started. So, when you were a kid, what did you want to become when you grew up? And how does that connect to what you do today?
Yeah, well, I've always been curious as a kid, so I used to read a lot, and I've always been a visual thinker. So I did not learn a lot in the classroom, but I used to come back and essentially connect ideas, make sense of things by really thinking about, how these ideas connect to each other. It's usually been difficult for me to just go after rote learning from a textbook, which was what our schools encouraged at that point. And it was a lot of fun for me to create my own maps of how I thought about what I was being taught. So from that perspective, I've always been a self-learner. I've always been curious. So in those contexts, I think what I do today was very much how I was wired from the beginning. Despite that, I was pushed along a fairly linear, straight-jacketed career path initially by those around me. So go to engineering school, then go and get an MBA, and then join the big tech. And so I did that till 4 or 5 years into my career, and then realized that the questions that fascinate me today, those questions were coming up in my head at that point. And I realized that I really wanted to devote my life to answering those questions and really build my career around helping the stakeholders who are interested in those questions. And so I've been very fortunate to be able to do that very successfully and on my own terms. So that's sort of been my journey to this point.
That is fantastic. And it is powerful that you had that ability to have those kind of visual thinking, but also able to follow the academic route. Did you struggle in academy or were you able to manage both?
And so when you say academic route, you mean when I was studying in my
When,
childhood,
when
right?
you were studying, when you went
Yeah, I
to
was. Yeah,
yes, those MBAs.
yeah, no, for sure. I think, it's important to know what you're good at and what you're not. I'm not very good at paying attention in a classroom lecture, but I'm actually very good at standardized testing. I realized for whatever reason, I was really good at standardized testing because once I figured how to learn it myself, I could answer those questions very well. So it's just that I didn't have a very straightforward way of following the way an instructor wanted me to learn something. And I think that's interesting for me now because when I see different types of people in my audience, I'm able to relate to them in different ways because some people are very good visual thinkers. Some people need specific catchphrases and words to hang their hat on and then build around it. So different people absorb concepts in different ways. And, just having had my own journey with it helps me bring those things out in the right way to different audiences.
Yeah, that is fantastic. Yes. Offline earlier, we were talking about platform revolution. So how your passion came about digital platform? Because in the past, we all knew about tech and stuff like that, but to formalize that and
Yeah.
release the digital platform, how did that come across?
Yeah. So no, it's a great question. I never set out to write about platforms or think about platforms. The question that was guiding my work and still guides my work is that there's something that fundamentally changes in the economy when new technologies come in. And in the late 2000s, when I started thinking about this, we had the convergence of three technologies: mobile phones, or smartphones to be precise. Smartphones, improvements in data capture and social technologies that were allowing us to capture data, like social networks, but also improvement in data technologies. And then finally, cloud computing. And so, because of those three things happening together, there was a significant upheaval in business models. The question that captivated my attention was, what separates the winners from the losers when such shifts happen? Because the new winners are different from the old winners. You need to understand under what conditions do the old winners continue to win, under what conditions do new winners become sustainable. And in order to answer that question, and I'm still answering that question in the course of my work, obviously, you want a clear articulation that explains a lot of things that are happening, because people were trying to explain it saying online is beating offline, but then you would see exceptions and you would say, well, maybe not. And somebody was saying, well, data is beating non-data, and then again you would see exceptions. So my point was, what's fundamentally changing about business models? And that's where I articulated that as a shift from pipeline centric business models, where you create product and ship it out, to platform centric business models where you connect stakeholders together and allow them to interact with each other.
Yeah, definitely. This platform revolution was a big eye opening for me. And actually, now I can see exactly as you are talking about what actually interests you wasn't the tech aspect, because even
Yeah.
on platform revolution is was all about how business model were transformed and how people are doing that, like with those new technology. When I was reading your book Reshuffle, I saw also that it was again talking about how the world, how the system, how everything is changing again. And as you said earlier, who is going to be now the new winners and the new
Right.
losers? Actually, that is going to be something that you argue that people talk about AI in a way of task, etc. But you
Yeah.
argue that AI is about coordination. Tell us more about your theory, your thesis, where you are coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I get into that, I'll just say that the way I think about all of this is not even tech and business models. It's about what are the games companies play, right? And it's important, even though the metaphor of a game may sound abstract, but fundamentally we are playing games. There are certain rules about where value sits, how you capture that value, how you serve the customer, and we build businesses around those assumptions. But when technology shifts, and not just technology, you could have market shifts, regulatory shifts, geopolitical shocks. When those things happen, the rules of the game change. And if you're still stuck playing the old game, you might get very good at playing a game which does not make sense anymore. And in my work with companies, I've realized that a lot of the times companies fail not because they're bad at execution, but because they're getting really good at playing the wrong game and they're not realizing it. Right. So that's the key point. And that brings me to the point that you raised, which is very central to the message of my book, which is that today, with AI coming in, a lot of companies are betting on the fact that the game that they're supposed to play is automation, that they're supposed to make things better, faster, cheaper, apply agentic workflows, make things better, reduce the cost base by firing workers, and maybe all of those things will happen as well. But the point is, that misses the real game that any technological shift introduces, which is not automation of today's work, but reorganizing the work and reorganizing your business models, reorganizing how you compete by changing the entire game. So you fundamentally reorganize how economic activity is structured. So let me give a simple example to illustrate this, because it might sound a little vague. I take the example of the shipping container. And I use that example as the opening example in my book because I want to take the reader away from this obsession with
Mhm.
intelligence. How intelligent is AI? And my point is that economic activity can be reorganized even around relatively dumb technologies. You don't need the core technology to reach human level intelligence, which is what we are seeking with AI today. But what happened with the shipping container, for instance, is that when the shipping container was started being used in shipping, its first order effects played out as automation, because before that, shipping used to happen with break bulk cargo, and you needed dock workers to move cargo up and down from the ship onto the port. And so port operations were very manual, but once you put it in a shipping container, that cargo could now be handled with cranes. And so port operations got automated. And so the first order effects were automation, which is where a lot of our thinking with AI, excuse me, is as well today. But the real value of the shipping container played out not through the automation of the port, but by changing the logic of logistics at a global scale. And that happened when trucks, trains, and ships agreed on a common standard and a structure for the shipping container so that the container could be moved across different modes of transport seamlessly, which meant that suddenly logistics from point A to point B anywhere in the world became extremely reliable. Now, the reason that's important is that before this happened, logistics was not reliable. A lot of the old game was structured around the assumption that logistics is unreliable. So that meant you co-located your suppliers with yourself, you kept operations in-house, and you managed everything internally inside your company. So manufacturing was very vertically integrated. But what happened was that once logistics became reliable, you could now have your suppliers across the world. You could have global supply chains. China emerged as a superpower thanks to the shipping container. Singapore became very powerful because it established a strong node in the global supply chain network. So, my point is that the winners and losers emerged not because of what happened at the port, but what happened once all economic activity got reorganized around the shipping container. And so, there are two key points over there. One, look for second order effects that play out through coordination, not through automation, because it reorganized how logistics was coordinated. And secondly, it's not the performance of the core technology that drives that shift. It's the performance of a larger socio-technical system. So the shipping container is a very weak technology in itself, but when combined with a standardized format across different forms of transport and a unified contract, that is what made logistics reliable. And so what really transformed the world around the shipping container was the larger socio-technical system that adopted it. And that's what we'll see with AI as well, even though right now we're obsessed with what AI can and can't do.
Mhm. In that manner, then, how can we translate that into this AI world? The way that, as you say, the containers has
Yeah.
been a game changer. What is the new way we should be thinking instead of, as you say, move beyond this automation obsession?
Yeah.
And in terms of coordination, how should we start to think about this? Where is the first point to start to think about how we can reorganize everything?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing that you need to think about is what is the assumption of your game today? So what assumption is your business built? And typically, the assumption that manufacturing was built on before the shipping container was that shipping is unreliable. And hence you needed to keep your suppliers close by. You needed to have large stocks. You could not do just-in-time inventory and so on. So there were some assumptions on which the entire logic of business was based, and that was dismantled. Today, in the knowledge industry, and every industry today creates value through knowledge. Even if you are in shipping or mining, which may seem very physical, the large value drivers even in these industries are very knowledge based. For instance, if you can use AI to predict which minerals
Where
are
exactly is the gold?
exactly, or even in mining to predict where the minerals are located, you can improve your ROI on exploration. And that's the lack of prediction is the primary driver of waste today. So my key point is that if you look at any knowledge industry, the key assumption on which a lot of knowledge industries are based is that either knowledge is very expensive to get access to. So expensive prospecting and mining is an example. AI improves the ability to predict deposits, then that assumption goes away. So how then does mining reorganize around it? Or on the other side, an example much more easily that we can associate with is think of professional services. Over there, the assumption is the access to some forms of knowledge work is expensive because you need to send people to 4 years of college, and then even when they come out you need to train them. And so both hiring an educated person and constantly training them, both of those things are expensive eventually to get access to knowledge work. Now knowledge is not getting commoditized, but some forms of knowledge work are getting commoditized because 3 years or 4 years back, translating a document was expensive knowledge work and people were paid high salaries for that. And now that's available at zero cost. So the cost of accessing that chunk of knowledge work has dramatically collapsed. Now, when that assumption changes, the assumption of industries that were structured around the logic of industries that was structured around the assumption that knowledge work will be expensive, that logic completely unravels. So that's my key point, that when I say don't look at automation, look at the new coordination, it essentially means that your business, your industry works on certain assumptions. You have to look out for whether those assumptions still hold true. And if they do not, it is inevitable that the entire structure will be reorganized, because we will find a new way to coordinate value creation in that structures. If you were based, if you were running on the assumption that knowledge is scarce and expensive, the way you coordinated access to that knowledge was by hoarding talent. You would build a McKinsey and go and hire the most expensive talent and then charge high rates for others to access that. But if that assumption changes, the way you coordinate the new structures of organizations, what companies will get paid for, everything starts changing. So that's the key point.
I love that idea, actually. Yes. So the problem is that sometimes we don't even know what assumption we have built anything on.
Yeah.
So how is it then possible for somebody to think about, okay, which assumption have I built my business on, and how can I completely change? And also, actually, on the top of that, you also give Shein example. Can you
Yeah.
also unpack using the Shein
Yeah.
example?
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
have how have they been able to
Yeah.
orchestrate everything to become this juggernaut or whatever in
Yeah.
this AI driven platform?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I say, assumption, I'm just saying that with the new technology coming in, question everything about your business. Okay. Because there are certain things about our business that we just take as the static truth because it's worked for the last 40 years like that. We've grown up for 40 years in that company working like that. And everybody who looks like us works like that. Right. So if you were in the fashion business, there were certain assumptions. Assumption number one was that if you wanted to predict the next style that would work in the market, you had to go to Milan, you had to go to Tokyo, you had to figure out what was happening, sense the market, and come back with styles. You needed these merchandisers with high end taste to figure out, what was working. Maybe that's true for certain forms of fashion, but maybe it wasn't true for all forms of fashion, right? So that was the first assumption. The second assumption was that once you've figured out what is going to work in the next season, you'll have to just be very sure about what bets you are making on which styles, and then build large production runs, because factories need large production runs. They won't work for, and it won't be cost effective to work with small production runs. And once that played out, you would then launch it in the market, and then you'd go back for the next 4 month cycle to launch the sense the next trend and launch the next trend, whether it's a 4 month or a 6 month cycle, right? Now, with AI, a lot of those things, and in this case, I'm not just talking about AI, but digital technology, social networks, intelligent manufacturing, everything. Ultimately, what's important is not whether LLMs are intelligent or not. What's important is if the entire system of technologies that are available at your disposal can fundamentally change the assumptions in your business. So, the first assumption that Shein, which is a Chinese fashion company, it's often derided for a lot of reasons, rightfully so. But we should still look at what's unique and what's the innovation over there that we can learn from. So, with the example of Shein, the first assumption that they break down is that sensing the market is expensive. And even before Shein, you had Zara, the Spanish fashion retailer, which would sense the market by capturing data from the store and then responding very quickly. So that had already changed the logic away from Milan and Tokyo. But Shein takes it even further. It constantly senses the market, not with people sitting in the stores or crunching data coming from store sales, but from capturing data from social networks in terms of which kinds of styles are trending, what's happening. And it's not even styles, they're looking at micro styles. Like it could be one celebrity wearing a certain feathered hat and getting a lot of likes. So they're sensing very small micro styles. They're using that to inform design. And then the key thing that they do is that they create a fully intelligent learning manufacturing setup, which works as follows. They create a design, they send it to a network of production, manufacturing companies where a really small batch order can be done very quickly. And once that batch order is run, it could be 100 units or 200 units, much smaller than what used to be the case. That order is tested out in the market, and the learnings from that are immediately taken back to either expand the production or abandon it and move to the next micro style. So it's a constantly learning, constantly improving intelligent engine. And, unlike a lot of other cases where we see learning happening only at the interface. So, a retailer, their supply chain may not be intelligent, but their online website may still be intelligent to personalize what you're looking for. So there's learning there, but it's only at the consumer interface, only at the channel. Unlike that, here the whole system is learning. And so it completely breaks the assumptions around which traditional fashion was set up. And that's why it's able to create a new model which the incumbent cannot compete with.
Yeah, that is fascinating how they did it. Can anybody do this? If I'm a startup, for example, I'm going to do a fashion tech kind of
Yeah.
business. Am I able to also pull together what Shein did? Do you need like a lot of resource, like AI powered centers somewhere to do this?
Yeah, so I think there are two aspects to it. One is resourcing, but the second, even if you do get resourcing, the second piece is whether you are constrained by your existing investments, whether you're architecturally constrained so that you cannot move in a new direction. So anybody who has set up a manufacturing setup that simply cannot produce micro batches and is optimized for it's running on economies of scale and can only build these really large batches, all of their investments till date have gone into a system which cannot work in micro batches. So if those assets cannot be repurposed, and in most cases they cannot be, then it becomes difficult for them to just say we're going to emulate Shein, right? So one thing as an incumbent very often is we often run into the slow incumbent fallacy, which is that we say that incumbents fail because they are slow to move and they are culturally risk averse. My point is that even if they are not culturally risk averse and slow to move, they are unable to move because they are constrained by what they've already invested in. So it's not just culture, it's architecture. It's it's that structure that's preventing them from moving forward. On the other hand, as a startup, again, there are certain plays where in order to get to the new system, that the new target system that you're getting at, you need to invest a lot of money up front to stop that chicken and egg cycle. So if I take the Shane example again, in order for Shane to get to a place where it can reliably predict what to produce versus not, and hence minimize wasted batches of production, it has to learn a certain it has to get its learning to a certain level. And so it needs funding to get the learning to that level, at which point, because its prediction improves, the return on investment on every run, the return on investment overall improves because there are fewer wasted runs that are happening, and there are increasingly a better ability to sense things on the demand side. So both improving wastage ratios on the supply side, and secondly, improving the ability to demand, to predict, to sense the right style on the demand side. Both those things, once they reach a certain level of accuracy, then the ROI improves as a whole. Until you get to that point, you are a cash burning machine. So you do need resources to get to that point.
Okay. So actually, I can see that there is a perfect partnership between startups and incumbent then. One cannot do this because they are constrained perhaps by their very heavy kind of infrastructure, and the next can be agile but haven't got results, right? So is there then an opportunity for startup to partner with incumbent in this case to move forward to have this AI driven model that can work beautifully?
Yeah, I think that there certainly is something over there, and it always brings us back. So there's certainly a complementarity in capabilities. I think that's what you're getting at. That incumbents are good at something, startups are good at something else. Incumbents have resources, startups do not. Incumbents are constrained, startups are not. So there's certainly complementarity. But complementarity is not enough for that synergy to play out, because alongside that, you also have to answer the build or buy question. And what I mean by that is, do you need to own, which capabilities do you need to own? And can you manage them yourself, or is your partner building those capabilities? And if it's the partner building the capabilities that you need to own, then what's the structure by which you can extend your ownership in that direction? So I think that is where a lot of these incumbent startup relationships sort of break down, because even though on paper the complementarity is very evident, choice of what to build and what to buy, what should you own versus what can you let the other player manage on their own, that is where the tension actually comes in. So in the few cases where that can be effectively managed, this can be a really good way for the two to come together.
In that case, then what's the best solution to do that? So if I'm a startup and I don't want to partner perhaps with an incumbent, what would be the best scenario for me?
Well, I think, in general, at the startup, and this has nothing to do with AI specifically, but in general, as a startup, you should always, first of all, see whether the problem or the solution architecture that you're going after aligns with the kinds of capabilities you have in house and the ability to build a team around. So if you're building something like Shane, not everybody can do that. So do you have the right access to resources, but also the right access to talent in order to do that? So I would first of all say choose your solution architecture carefully based on the constraints of the resources at your disposal, because there's always a perfect way to solve something and it may not be the right way for you. And if it's not the right way for you, you'll end up in that position where you don't have sufficient funds to go all the way to improving both the supply side and demand side economics, as I mentioned in this case, so that they work in your favor. So the first thing is ensuring that the right team is solving the right problem with the right solution, which works for them. The second thing I think is to be very clear about what trade offs you're willing to accept in accessing resources. This applies not just to raising funding from venture capital, but it applies even to how you manage relationships with um, incumbents. There are certain industries, I think Spotify is a great example. It's impossible for the startup to exist without getting into bed with the incumbents. So there are certain industries where that's going to happen, because in the music industry, Spotify doesn't work with the labels. It simply cannot play, right? And so you need to figure out what's the trade-off that you're willing to accept. If I take the Spotify example again, if you don't want to play with labels and they're always trying to reduce the dependence, you're left with a part of this whole audio ecosystem which is not profitable at all. So you could get into podcasts, you could get into indie artists who are not with labels currently, but that's not where the real money is. So you have to figure out what kind of a trade-off you're willing to accept. I mean, the same thing is happening in the automotive industry to a large extent, where there are two types of players who are making different trade-offs. So there are the Teslas and the BYDs of the world, who are essentially saying, we want to be the full stack player and we'll change the rules of the game for the incumbents. But that comes with its own set of resourcing and talent and IP access. But on the other hand, there are a lot of other players who are saying, we'll simplify how we'll create the technology that the incumbents can use, but then they're always stuck playing within the boundaries of what the incumbents allow them to do. So you always have these two plays coming up, and there's always a trade off involved.
How, if somebody is in this job and they can see the big iceberg coming in front of their nose right now, how do we reinvent ourselves when we know that that big ball is coming right in front of us? We're going to be laid off very soon. Any strategy for those?
Yeah, that's a great question, because very often when we look at how technology transforms opportunities, we look at previous waves of automation, and in most waves of automation, we've had the workers reinvent themselves. There's been a period of creative destruction, if you will, where they've not been able to do it, but then eventually we've seen things settle down. But however, the pace of change with AI is so fast, and it's not a static technology. A lot of previous automation was very static. It would come, hit you once, and its capabilities would stay the same. And it's just that, your existing capabilities may not be required, but you had the time to potentially move in another direction. So the pace of change is fast. So it's more of a shock. So very often, I would say that the right analogy to look at is not previous automation necessarily, and I'm going to be a little negative in what I'm saying, but I would still encourage people to look at this analogy. The right analogy to look at is the China shock that happened to American manufacturing. So even though it was not a technology shock, it was a situation where an alternate form of labor created a substitute for American labor. And what we've seen since then is that most of that manufacturing labor got displaced into the services industry and ended up flipping burgers at fast food joints, and they were never able to get back the salaries that they were getting in the manufacturing sector. So while we talk about reinvention, there has to be sufficient capacity in your economy for that reinvention to happen. But what really happened in this case was, even though demand increased, it increased to serve a capacity in a fundamentally different economy. And so those are issues that we need to think about carefully today, because we're operating in a global market. And when AI comes in, it's possible that even if demand increases, it may not create capacity for new jobs in your specific economy. The second point, though, is that the challenge of reinvention is also more complex today, because a lot of the jobs that previous automation used to impact were relatively routine jobs. And so you always had this frontier where this possibly something else that has not been automated yet that will get created that I can get into. Today, we're working with a technology that's going after jobs that have required years, decades of experience to get to a certain level of performance. And this technology is providing substitutes for some parts of that job at equivalent levels of performance instantly. And then it's, as it improves, because there's a lot of funding going into it, there's the ability to constantly train it. As it improves, its frontier of what else it can do constantly increases as well. So we're talking about jobs that are not, skills that are not easy to acquire. They've taken decades to acquire and then they suddenly go away. And we're talking about the fact that the technology that's being brought in is also constantly improving. So my point in saying all of this, and I'm going to start with this pessimistic picture, is to say there's not going to be any easy answers. There's going to be a lot of the workforce that's going to find it difficult to reinvent themselves if they think of easy answers like AI won't take your job, but someone using AI will. Those kinds of easy answers are not really going to provide you any solution over here. The only thing that I would say, no matter where you are, there are two or three things that you need to keep in mind increasingly. The first is that agency is going to be more valuable than ever. The more agency you can have over your career, the more you take ownership of that rather than trust somebody else, the more you will be able to consistently increase your chances of success as you move forward. So even if you have displacement in the short term, if you have agency, if you're constantly looking for what's changing, what new opportunities are emerging, that's going to be more important than ever before. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that reskilling, while it sounds like an obvious answer that, I got de-skilled, I need to reskill. Reskilling without knowing what to reskill to is a hamster wheel, right? And so, in order to know what to reskill to, you need to know what's changing, what's the new system that's coming up, what are the previous assumptions on which the previous game was being played, and what new game is going to come up, right? So, you need to reskill based on understanding what the new game is going to look like. And there are many examples of this. When I wrote the book, I talked about the distinction between people who create algorithms today, algorithmic systems, and people who work within them. So Uber is a great example. The Uber data scientist is working above the algorithm and is designing the algorithm and is being paid very well. But the Uber driver is working below the algorithm. He doesn't own how he gets access to work, and he doesn't own how much he can charge for it. Both of those are owned by the algorithm. So he has lost agency and value. And ever since I wrote the book, there are people from highly skilled jobs. So when we say Uber drivers and delivery drivers, we think that that's not us listening to this podcast. But data analysts have written out to me and said that over the last 15 years, we've had the secure job, but only now do we realize that we were constantly training the algorithm and we've suddenly gone below the algorithm because technology has improved so much in the last 5 years. And there's no way for us to use the same skills because the algorithm has absorbed a lot of the skills that we trained it on. Programmatic advertising. There were advertising professionals who used to work on Facebook and Google who had very stable jobs till 5 years back. And they say that now the algorithm does a lot of that because it was constantly learning across the board. So the discretion associated with these jobs that allowed these jobs to capture a premium have gone away. So, it's important to understand that very often it's not AI taking our job. It's sometimes technology working alongside us and constantly reducing the level of discretion and agency we have, and through that, reducing the salary that we can charge or the premium that we can charge for a skill as well. So it's important to understand all of these issues. The final thing I will just say is that if you want to take agency, if you want to have agency and take charge of your career, don't ask yourself, what should I learn today to keep getting better? It's important to think about that. But first ask yourself, what will the world look like for me, 1 year from now? And what is my bet on how I will be relevant in that world? So have a clear view of what the playing field is going to look like and what your winning game is going to look like. Based on that view, make a bet and say, okay, given that that's the thing, I have a year in front of me, I'm going to invest in this direction. Start investing in that direction, learning those things. But every couple of weeks, keep asking yourself, are those assumptions still true based on what's happening? Maybe the models have changed. Maybe something else has happened because of which my view of where things will be in 1 year has changed. So if you build that lens where you're not just blindly learning things, but you're constantly developing the ability to have foresight into what the world is going to look like and what will help you stay relevant, that is going to be really important. And a lot of that, the results of that may not pay off for you in the next 6 to 8 months, but they will certainly pay off in the next 3 to 5 years. And I think for whatever reason, all of us will have to start thinking about our careers in those time frames now. It's going to be less about let's switch to the next job possible, because you might just switch your way into irrelevance. You have to keep thinking about what will make me stay relevant even as the world is changing.
Oh, that is beautiful. I love that actually. Very, very thought-provoking answer, because which actually lead me to what's the point of going to uni these days? Because you know that by the time you come out, what you think that you went for is going to change. Do we need to still go to uni, or actually do education has to even change also the way that we are learning? Because as you say, we need the high level of agency, which
Yeah.
education is not going to give us, because it's up to us based on our vision, based on what we want to do. So what's the point of the education in this system these days now?
Yeah, I think everybody in education also knows that education has to change. They just don't know how, and they don't know how it'll change, right? But education certainly has to change. It's been very static. But even within education, I would say that more than anything, the incentives have to change, because when we are in the education system, irrespective of what we are learning, we are incentivized to succeed on standardized tests. And somewhere we are incentivized to keep believing in very static zero sum approaches of how the world works. So, if you're in a relative grading system, you just believe that everybody else not performing well helps your grade move further. And as we move in this direction where the world is constantly changing, that kind of thinking actually holds us back, because it prevents us from seeing what other new opportunities exist caught in competing within static frames. So the incentives, I believe, have to change first and foremost. The more we rely on standardized testing, the more we rely on rote learning, right from the beginning all the way, irrespective of what is being taught. Because very often people say, oh, we need to teach AI, we need to teach autonomy, we need to teach all these new things. And maybe that's important. But I think that people who are taught, who are incentivized to learn rather than to test, are people who will constantly be able to learn as they move forward. And so even if you don't change the courses that they took in the first 6, 8, 10, 12 years of their education, if you encouraged the ability to learn in them, and if you incentivized learning over testing, they will have the ability to constantly learn. So I think we need the how of education needs to change before the what of education starts changing. There's too much focus today on changing the what of education, because there's questions about, should we even read history? Should we even learn about all these things when you have access to a history in an LLM? And I think that's the wrong question. It's more about whatever you teach. What are you? It's not about what subject you're teaching. It's about the mindset you're teaching the learner about what learning means for them and how it ties to rewards, because everybody eventually is thinking about rewards when they're going into education. So if you instill the fact that acing tests is how you get to rewards, then that's not really creating that uh, you know drive for learning to get to the reward. And as we move forward, we'll have to have that constant curiosity, the ability to learn, the ability to develop that judgment through constantly testing, our assumptions in the market. We'll all have to behave like Shein, right? Because if you look at the Shein example, what does it do? It's constantly absorbing signals from the market. It's constantly learning, it's constantly testing, and it's improving its hypotheses on that basis. And if we have to stay relevant, we have to do that as well. But our education system teaches us not to do that. It teaches us to be more like the traditional manufacturing setup.
Because actually the point I think of the education in the past was to teach us to become employee, but now there's not going to be any job. The
That's
AI is going to do that. So therefore there's no point anymore to do
the,
that.
the, yeah, I mean, there is certainly going to be work. I mean, people think that there's not going to be any work for humans to do. And I don't think it's true, because what happens with technology is that you end up with complementarity. Eventually, the economy will decide which things people can do best and which things AI can do best. And it will, things will automatically get allocated on that basis. So work will always be there. But the traditional assumptions about where that work is performed in a static job, to your point, inside an organization that's managing your career, all those assumptions are going to go away. So we are distracted by this whole thing of job loss and work is going to go away. We should really be thinking about the fact that the structures in which the work is performed today and rewarded today, that's going to go away. So how should I be thinking about what's going to come in the future?
Yeah, that's fantastic. So We are coming a bit to the close of the interview, but one question I wanted to say that if you were redesigning the society right now with this AI at the center, where would you begin? How do you redesign a world with AI?
Yeah, I mean, there's some very easy answers to that because you've given me all the freedom to redesign how the world works. They may not necessarily be practical, but they're very easy answers, right? The first part of the answer is that I would want to create agency first technologies. What I mean by that is we've created for the last 10 to 12, I would say 20 years at least, technologies and technological systems that take agency away from us. So we don't know our data. Amazon knows our data. We don't know our data. Facebook knows our data. So the first thing is, if the data stays with us, if agents work on our behalf, then even if AI comes in, they won't be working for the big platforms. They'll be working for us. So agency as a design principle is the first thing I would look at, right? People talk about centralization, decentralization. I think that's a manifestation. Decentralization is a manifestation of agency, and centralization is a manifestation of where that agency is moving instead. What's important is that agency, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing that I would look at from a redesigning perspective, again, I think it's not very practical given the incentives that exist today. But if I had to really redesign the utopian society, the second thing I would look at is revisit all our laws of extraction. How much can be extracted? How much can any entity end up extracting before there's a mechanism for redistribution? In general, we think of mechanisms of redistribution as bargaining or taxation. So you set up unions to bargain and redistribute some value back to workers, or you use taxes to redistribute things to society. I think those mechanisms of redistribution are very archaic. In order to create new mechanisms of redistribution, we should actively think about what is the structure of the economy that is emerging, and how can economic activity be organized in a way that it is automatically redistributed and prevents concentration. So agency is one way to do that. Because if you give the data back to the user, there's automatically some redistribution that's going to happen when agents start working on your behalf and so on. But if you combine these two things, right? If you could combine these two things and start a society and an economy from scratch, I think the world would be a very good place. But that's a big if.
Yeah, we never know. Perhaps there will maybe one big AI that is going to erase everything and then we can start from scratch. So who
Let's
knows?
hope so.
So tell me, what does purposeful leadership look like? How can we, again, we talk about this above algorithm and below algorithm thing. So how can we stay on purpose in this AI driven world? How can we really, don't get fearful of the AI, but really stay on purpose?
Yeah, I think the word purpose is interpreted very widely, and I have my own interpretation. I believe that you can't define purpose unless you can define the stakeholder. The stakeholder then determines the incentives, and that then creates the boundaries within which you define your purpose. So you need to be very clear about who your stakeholder is. Very often, who we call our stakeholder in our PowerPoints is not necessarily our stakeholder, because our behaviors show where our incentives truly lie. And so it's important to be very clear about who that stakeholder is. I think even from a policy perspective, policymakers should think about, if they're creating policy or regulating a certain industry, who's the real stakeholder that's being served over there. And I think that sort of creates the boundaries of purpose. And I think all of it comes back to the fact that the words like purpose, impact, success are not a one size fits all word. They're very contextual, and you get to set that context, and on the basis of that, your incentives to define what that means for you comes in. And so I think that's the starting point. If your stakeholders are those that incentivize extraction, then your purpose will automatically move in that direction, unfortunately.
But as individual, how can we actually stay on our own purpose?
I mentioned this a few times over here, but I'm a very big believer that we are moving to a world where agency is going to be important than ever before. Okay. And in order for us to live meaningful lives, we've so far been told that in order to live a successful life, you need to compete. And so people say that they're very competitive. And I think it's important for people to not be competitive and be ambitious instead. And there's a big distinction between the two. Ambitious means that you have agency, you've decided what your game is going to look like, and you want to get better at that game every day. You don't really care about beating others at their game. Competitiveness means that you've decided that you've chosen a game that's already being played and you're trying to figure out who all you need to beat in order to be successful. And this goes back to my point about education as well, because education teaches us to be competitive. It doesn't teach us to be ambitious.
Collaborate. Exactly. Being
Right.
ambitious, collaborate as well.
I think, collaboration is inevitable if you're ambitious because it's impossible to achieve your goals on your own, right? So I don't necessarily see collaboration as the opposite of competition. I see ambition as the opposite of competition because ambition, in my view, assumes a positive sum pie. It assumes that you don't have to step on somebody else to achieve your goals. It assumes that you can define your game around your unique abilities. And I think, as especially in a world where AI takes away a lot of the standardized jobs, these things will become much more important than ever before.
Sanjeet, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. I can stay here for another 2 days. But in one line, before we go, what is the most powerful insight that you want people to take away from your work and everything that you've been doing so far?
I think the one thing that underpins all of my work is something that I mentioned a few times over here, and that is that always question your assumptions. You can't win the next game by getting better at the previous one. So always question your assumptions and try to understand what's changing that will eventually force you to question those anyway.
Where can our listeners learn more about you and your work?
So you can buy my book Reshuffle. There's the full thesis of what we've talked about. You can follow me on Substack. It's called platforms.substack.com. So it's platforms, the plural.substack.com. And I write almost on a weekly basis. And so you can get my latest material over there. You can go on YouTube or Spotify and search my name. And I've been on tons of podcasts. So you'll come across all of them to get a better flavor of what I'm talking about before you get into the book and other things. And my website is shufflebook.com, where you can follow me for other updates.
If there's one thing to take away from this conversation with Sanjay, this is this. AI doesn't just change tasks. It changes the rules of the game. And when the rule change, you must change how you play. What makes these moments so dangerous is not automation, it's invisibility. People don't lose relevance because they are bad at what they do. They lose relevance because they keep optimizing assumption that no longer holds. So Sanjit reminded us that agency is becoming the new currency. When you work below the algorithm, you lose discretion, pricing power, and voice. So when you work above the algorithm, you design, orchestrate, and decide. So here is your purpose print for today, for the week. And this one is about courage as much as clarity. One, what is one assumption your work or career is built on that may no longer be true? What is one place where you are optimizing or execution instead of relevant? And what is one way you are trading agency for comfort or perceived stability? So map your work honestly and ask, what do I own? What decides my value? Where do algorithms decide for me? Then design one that moves upward toward design, orchestration, and foresight. In a world reshuffled by AI, purpose is not about doing more. It's about deciding more. This is how you live, lead, and thrive on purpose. And if you want support reconnecting with your strength and your personal North Star, you'll find a free quiz, Ikigai quiz at francinebelli.com/podcast. And the show notes of the episodes are also available on the same page, francinebelli.com/podcast. When you truly see how power and value are shifting, neutrality disappears. The next question becomes unavoidable. What is all this progress actually for? This is what we'll be discussing next episode. So I'll see you next week for another episode of season 11 of Meaningful Work, Meaningful Life podcast. Until then, dream, act, and make an impact. Lots of love.